You're listening to This Week in America with Rick Bratton.
Welcome back, everybody. This Week in America, website thisweekinamerica.us. As mentioned, Alexandra Risen, our guest on the program today. Alexandra has lived her life as a gradual migration from the northwestern prairies to the hilly southeast, all the while enjoying nature and increasingly warmer plant hardiness zones. She's a child of Ukrainian parents that ran from Russian oppression straight into World War II. She loves her garden as much as she loves technology and loves New York City as much as she loves hiking in New Hampshire's backcountry. She's published essays in newspapers and online magazines, recently started a blog, foragelove.com, to encourage city people to eat weeds and tap their maple trees. I'm sure we'll talk about that during the course of the program. Unearthed is her first book. She lives in gardens with her husband, son, and rescued dog in Ontario. The book Unearthed, Love, Acceptance, and Other Lessons from an Abandoned Garden, a Canadian nonfiction bestseller, one of Toronto Life's 18 best reads for the summer months. Alexandra Risen with us on This Week in America. Alexandra, welcome to the program. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Rick.
I stumbled over that. It's one of the must-reads for summer, and summer's over, but it's still a good read for the fall. It's a fascinating book, a memoir. And let's start where this journey began. And it really turned into a journey for you as you and your husband are buying property, a 1-acre piece of property in the city of Toronto. Talk about that and how that evolved into this whole experience for you.
Yes, well, 10 years ago, we were fortunate enough to stumble across this property, and it had a sprawling, overgrown garden. And as we started to work on it, it unexpectedly became a portal for me to explore nature, its healing powers, and somehow that led into an exploration of my family's history as well.
What's interesting is the fact that it started to bring back memories, and you didn't buy it because of that reason, did you? But as you're out working in the garden, this starts bringing back memories, some painful memories from the childhood.
Exactly, and you know how that is sometimes, fragrance or a color or a texture can jiggle up a memory, and that is sort of what started to happen in the garden. As well, I'm not a horticulturalist, and I had to learn a lot of plant names and behaviors as we were going along. And as I started studying plants, they kind of became people to me in a very strange way because they have their own habits and characteristics and ways about themselves. And so as I started to get to know each plant in my garden, I'd say, gosh, that plant reminds me of my mother or my sister. And I was taking some writing courses at the time, and I wrote a story about my mother being a lily of the valley. And as a product of war, my mother was uprooted and rerooted, and she still thrived in sun or shade. And she had all the same characteristics of this plant. And it's also one that she used to keep on the kitchen table. So the fragrance reminded me of her as well as its physical characteristics.
It's interesting. Yes, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
After that story, I just started writing more stories about plants and people.
And as you're digging into the garden, as you say, you're actually digging into your past. And at the same time, your father passes away, your mother is in declining health, and you start learning something about your past, your family history, as you're going through some documents. Talk about that, because everything seemed to be happening around that same time and fitting together for you and answering some questions.
You know, it's very interesting, Rick. I think sometimes when we become open to things, then it seems that they come to us when we're in the right state of mind and perhaps prepared to see what we need to see. In this case, indeed, I was just starting to think a bit about my parents' past, and it was a bit of a difficult past because post-war, they came via England to Canada, and a lot of people as well, as you know, went to the U.S. through the same route. They were different in the way they dealt with the trauma of war. My father was very introverted, and he just kind of crawled into himself and didn't speak a lot. My mother was a very forward thinker, and didn't speak about the war at all either, but for different reasons, because she was forging ahead into the future. And so my sister and I grew up knowing absolutely nothing about our family history, our past, relatives left behind in the old country. It was a taboo discussion. Not because I think of anything terribly bad, but just because these were people that couldn't cope with what they had seen and had their own way of surviving.
Right.
And so we lived in a bit of a mysterious void when it came to family. And I think as I was restoring the garden and I was losing my mother, I was finally open to trying to understand that void better. And I found some old documents while we were moving her from one home to another that I didn't know existed. And unfortunately, as I started to look at these documents and try and understand, they were birth certificates, marriage certificates, war documents. My mother was in such a state of dementia that she couldn't be helpful, and my father was already gone. So it was me and the garden and my documents that had to sort of coexist during my research.
You're listening to This Week in America, our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Our guest on the program is Alexandra Risen. She's the author of Unearthed, Love, Acceptance, and Other Lessons from an Abandoned Garden. Information available at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, at Alexandra's website, which is alexandrarisen, RISEN.com. And you go to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and link on directly to her website. It's interesting as you're talking about your childhood. You used the word silenced and unanswered questions. It was during this period and the garden helped you sort all of this out, where you started to put things in perspective, and you talk about learning about forgiveness and putting it in perspective during that time frame.
Yeah, I think, when we're younger, we only understand superficially what we see.
Yes.
And when we don't have context, and context isn't given to us by our families, we flail around a little bit. We're basically pack animals and have that need to belong to something. And when we don't feel like we belong to something, we start to search. And I think that's what I was looking for. I was looking for a sense of belonging and what I was a part of. And nature has a way of helping you figure that out, because our connection with nature is unconscious. It's almost primal. And it's almost religious in the way that we have to have faith in it. And it's imperfect but perfect, and we don't really understand it. But we know that somehow it makes us feel good when we're connected to nature. And so it can be very healing and therapeutic. And I think in that setting I was able to start to explore why my parents were so silent and, understand better and accept better what made them that way.
And this gave you sort of a connection with your parents in a way, didn't it? Because you said they had a great deal of respect for nature. They were able to roll with all the punches, the bad weather, that type of thing. That nature was very important to them.
Indeed, and it's funny that I've come full circle. I didn't really know them that well because they were very, not open as parents, but what I saw them do, and the one area I saw them connect, was if they were putting food by for the winter. My mother grew everything that we ate in the garden. She canned everything. My father pruned her apple trees. And the one place I saw them the happiest is when they were in the garden or preparing food for the winter. And so what I realize in retrospect is the qualities that they gave me, the legacy that I hope to leave to my son, is a notion of independence and that interconnectedness with the land and knowing what keeps us alive.
And in the book Unearthed, you talk about with the son, and maybe you sort of over-explain things, trying to make up for what you went through and not having that open communication with your parents. How difficult is it to balance, like, okay, that's enough. He's looking at me now like no more information is really necessary.
Yeah, I talk his ear off, and I, I recall when we had one of many birds and bees discussions. I would read him a bedtime story and then try to talk to him, and he would bury his head under the pillow and ask me to just sort of let him know when I'm finished. So, the poor guy, But I think that open communication between parents and kids today is super important, especially because of technology. And even though I'm a little bit of a tree hugger, I also adore technology and what it can do for us. But it does make us distant, and it's very easy to text our kids and our families and not have that discussion anymore, just talking over the dinner table. So I try very hard to offset the technology that pervades his world.
Well, it's interesting because as you were a child and maybe frustrated, sort of trying to find answers as a child, when you would hit that point where you hit a wall in trying to find out what life was about, what the family life was about, you would go outside and spend time outdoors. Do kids today miss that opportunity to get outside and to play and to just sort of smell the air and look around?
I think so. I don't know. I think that my son is probably the first, he's 17 now, he's probably the first generation that's really not doing that enough. We haven't seen the result of all the technology that these kids have been able to grow up with yet. I think that the next generation will sort of be the lesson learning, and I think I was one of the last generations that stayed out until it was dark and felt very safe anywhere I was outside at a very young age. But I hope that we reach a balance. I think eventually we'll find that right balance. Maybe not this generation.
Alexandra Risen, our guest in the program. The book is called Unearthed: Love, Acceptance, and Other Lessons from an Abandoned Garden. Her website is alexandrarisen.com. Books available wherever books are sold, and you can link on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us. Let's talk about the garden. And this really didn't start for this grand look-back history lesson, did it? You were just working in the garden. When did you realize, and this is a journey, by the way, that's taken 10 years, when did you decide this is really my sanctuary? I really enjoy being out here for a number of reasons.
I think it would be the day that we struck water. We didn't know there was a water feature. The land is very sloped, and because it was so overgrown, we started at the top of the slope and we didn't know it was at the bottom. So in the first year of basically barreling through all the weeds and undergrowth, we heard water. And because I grew up in a river valley along a river, that's where I used to play and skip rocks. And I love the romance of a babbling brook. And we heard water, and my husband, who's rather more practical than I am, was, concerned about floodplains and what kind of house we had bought. But for me, it was the moment that the garden and I connected in totality.
You talk about you were taking the writing lesson and you were writing about nature, and your teacher, instructor was saying, this is a memoir, keep going. You really were reluctant to do that, weren't you? It took a little encouragement to get you to actually to open up and to talk further about your life.
Yes, it's difficult to share your life on paper. If you're going to do so, you owe the reader honesty. And that means you honestly have to go deep within as well and take a good hard look at yourself and your emotions and why you felt them. And I think that it's important that we share perhaps a universal truth that a reader might be interested in thinking about in the context of their own lives as well. So, it takes some time and some courage, I have to say, but It has been a lovely experience. I have heard from so many readers and received many lovely letters about people's family, their gardens, pictures of flowers, stories of their family history, and I've had a tremendous connection with a lot of readers that I didn't expect to have, I didn't anticipate, and I'm very grateful for.
As we follow your transformation, it's interesting. You end by saying you were always resentful of your parents because there were unanswered questions as you were growing up. When you explored everything through using the garden, suddenly you ended up loving them. Talk about that transformation you went through. It sounds like you're really at peace with yourself in terms of family. You've been able to put that puzzle together.
Well, I certainly don't have all the answers, but I'm pretty sure I can guess that a lot of listeners have gone through some sort of process of understanding that their parents or people that raised them or were influential on them in their youth are simply people who are good and bad and flawed, and some have lived through very difficult times like the war, and sometimes their behavior may not be ideal or what we want or expect, but that's okay. That behavior is because of where they came from and what they've seen. And I think we all kind of go through that coming of age, maybe. It was a little bit difficult for me because of the circumstances of, my father and how he was very silent and the trauma that was experienced there. But I think on different levels, we probably all experience a little bit of that.
Yes, as you're reading the book Unearthed, it'd be hard-pressed to find somebody that would read it and not be able to make some analogy with their own life, some comparison with their own lives. You talk about soil being the new Prozac. Talk about that and whether you're trying to find answers to family mysteries or not, there is a therapeutic process, isn't there, a healing process by getting outdoors and being in nature.
That's for sure. The Japanese have a name for it. It's called Shinrin-yoku, which means bathing in the forest. And there have been studies done since the mid-'80s about the actual physical thing that happens to your body and your mind when you're out in nature. And they've found bacteria in soil that affect the serotonin levels, which are what makes you happy, basically, in your mind. So when you're out and in that, you are actually even breathing in good bacteria and good things. So there's a physical manifestation of health through nature. Forget about all the wonderful things that nature brings us in terms of, medicine and that unconscious connection that I was talking about.
Right. The book is Unearthed, Love, Acceptance, and Other Lessons from an Abandoned Garden. Alexandra Risen is the author and has been our guest on This Week in America. The book is available, as I say, all across the country. Information at the website, Alexandra Risen, that's RISEN.com. And you can click on directly by going to our website, thisweekinamerica.us, and get information on the book. Alexandra, it was a pleasure having you on the program. A fascinating memoir, an excellent story touching many people. Thank you for sharing it with us on the program.
Thank you so much, and I hope you get some time to play outside in the beautiful sunshine this weekend.
I am going to get out of here very shortly and get outdoors before we have to shovel the outdoors, so I'm going to take advantage of that. Again, Unearthed, the name of the book, Love, Acceptance, and Other Lessons from an Abandoned Garden. Alexandra Risen, our guest on This Week in America. We're right back after these messages. Don't go away.